Hello! Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome to another episode of the mildly interesting podcast, Amateur Investigators. Today we'll be discussing the Dyatlov Pass incident. I really hope that I'm saying that right. If you like the stuff that we do, make sure to follow us on Facebook and Instagram. Make sure to check out our website. Santos posts some very informative articles, some very nice articles. Great journalism there. It is mildly-interesting.co.uk. Follow us on Spotify and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Hit that bell or whatever to keep updated with our posts. But without further ado, I'm Akash Lush.
And I'm Jules Hunt.
And this is Mildly Interesting Amateur Investigators.
Mildly interesting.
No, seriously, just mildly interesting.
The Dyatlov Pass incident, or, as directly translated from Russian, the death of the Dyatlov group, was an event in which 9 Soviet trekkers died in the northern Ural Mountains between the 1st and 2nd of February 1959 under undetermined circumstances. The local investigation team and the local state government, up till now, their official conclusion to the case is that the Dyatlov group died because of an avalanche. But obviously, we wouldn't be talking about it if there was some contradictory evidence, if there was some conspiracy theories with some evidence behind them, because the way these people died and the way it was investigated was under weird circumstances. So, Santos, why don't you start us off by saying what the sort of background to this expedition? Who were these people and why did they go on this trip?
Right, so these were Soviet hikers who had the Grade 2 hiking pass permit. So it was essentially like the second highest permit you could get in Russia that like demonstrated your like hiking skill. So in order for you to get the third one, which is the highest, you need to do a trek of a specific amount of kilometers. So the 9 people in this group decided to do this pass track in the village of Vizhai, right? So our trip starts on the 25th in 1959 when the group arrived at the town of Ivdel, where they would then take like a truck to the village of Vizhai. So the group had a plan in mind to ski across the Northern Urals in Sverdlovsk in Oblast, right? So this was during February, which is the hardest and most dangerous time of the year to do so, which surely enough should have been a red flag to begin with, but we'll get into it as the sort of like the red flags start building up. Anyway, they begin the journey on the 27th of January, and everything goes smoothly for the first day, right? No problems. And then on the 28th, one of the trekkers turned back due to knee and joint pain, along with some side effects from other pre-existing health-related problems. I mean, at this point, only slap in the face would have been more obvious to, this is not going to go well. But the trek was pretty successful until the 1st, when they decided to cross the pass, hence the name, in order to camp on the opposite side. However, because of the bad snowstorms and visibility, the group ended up deviating somewhat west from the route they had planned. After they'd realized what they'd done, they decided to make a camp on the slope of the mountain, which would come to be a very, very bad decision. See, Dyatlov, being a smart hiker, had agreed to send a telegram to their sports club as soon as they returned to the village of Vizhai, where the village that I just mentioned they were earlier. And when they passed,
it was expected that he would return to Vizhai no later than 12 February, but Dyatlov had told Yudin, the guy who turned back because of knee and joint pain, that he expected that some delays. So 12 February passed, and there was no immediate reaction. But on the 20th of February, there was still no news from the Dyatlov group, and that's when relatives demanded a rescue operation. The head of the institute, where these were all like students, they were researchers from the university, the Ural University. So the head of the institute sent out the first rescue groups, consisting of volunteer students and teachers, and then later the army and militia, or just the police force, militia, the militia forces became involved, with planes and helicopters ordered to join the operation. Now, there were 9 people who went missing in the mountains in this pass. There was Dyatlov and the 8 other sort of skiers and hikers. Their bodies were found in groups. So, on 26 February, searchers found the group's abandoned and badly damaged tent on Kholat Siakel. This was the sort of this slope of the mountain where the campers decided to camp due to the fact that they had deviated west from their hike. Mikhail Sharavin, sorry, I'm gonna butcher all of these Eastern Russian names, but Mikhail, the student who found the tent, said the tent was, quotes, was half torn down and covered with snow. It was empty, and all the group's belongings and shoes had been left behind. Investigators said the tent had been cut open from the inside. 9 sets of footprints left by people wearing only socks or a single shoe or even barefoot could be followed, leading down to the edge of a nearby wood on the opposite side of the pass, roughly about 1.5 kilometers to the northeast. After about 500 meters, though, these tracks were covered with snow. So, already, this seems suspicious. Right? So, experienced hikers, by the way, as Santos mentioned, that they had the second highest level of certification within the Soviet Union. Experienced hikers deviated from their path and then set up camp on the slope of a mountain. They go missing, and then on the 26th of February, so about 14 days after they were supposed to return, they found their campsite badly damaged, their tent half torn down, cut open from the inside. And all of their belongings and most of their shoes had also been left behind. And the tent was sort of covered with snow. There's already, just from the initial discovery of the campsite alone, there's already this sort of, what's the word I'm looking for?
It just doesn't make too much sense.
It's sort of this air of like something happened.
Even then, you like with the main theory, which we'll get into, the main theory being the avalanche. This can still be explained. So imagine kind of they get woken up by the noise, and then they don't have enough time to get out of the way, so they don't have enough time to get dressed and just kind of like run away, right? But the fact that some have only one shoe, some have socks, some have barefoot, it doesn't make too much sense that they're all... You would expect them to be sort of like wearing somewhat the same things. Right, so... Akash, please continue. What happened next? How were the bodies found? And where?
So, already, there is a sense that they left in some sort of a panic, right? So, the tracks led to the edge of a nearby wood on the opposite side of the pass, about 1.5 kilometers, or nearly a mile to the northeast. After 500 meters, or 1,600 feet, these tracks were covered with snow. At the forest edge, under a large Siberian pine, they had to clarify, it is Russian tree. Under a large Siberian pine, the searchers found the visible remains of a small fire and the first 2 bodies. Like I said, there were 9 people, and their bodies were kind of discovered in groups. So, these were the bodies of, again, going to butcher these Eastern Russian names, but Krivonishenko and Doroshenko, shoeless and dressed only in underwear. The branches on the tree that they were under, where the remains of the fire were broken up to 5 meters high, suggesting one of the skiers had climbed up to look for something. Perhaps, the most known theory is perhaps they climbed up to get a better look of where the camp was. Now, Krivonishenko, I'm just going to call him Kriv. and Doroshenko. Kriv and Doroshenko were found near naked and shoeless, near the remains of a fire. Like, it already doesn't, like, it's weird that the party didn't stick together, but also that, like, these people were pretty much stripped naked. Between the pine and the camp, the searchers found 3 more corpses. Dyatlov, so the person leading the group, Kolmogorova, and Slobodin, who died in poses suggesting that they were attempting to return to the tent. So, what can we gather from these corpses? They obviously left the tent in a panic, enough of a panic to, like, pretty much destroy it from the inside so they can escape, and leave behind all their belongings and most of their clothes, it looks like. They got to what they believe was a safe area, they got to some woods. One of them appeared to maybe have tried to climb the tree, several branches were broken, and they attempted to make a fire. 2 of them died from what seemed like hypothermia, Kriv and Doroshenko, and then 3 of them, Dyatlov, Kolmogorov, I'm just gonna call him Kolm, and Slobodin, they all attempted to return to the tent, but died in the snow. So, that accounts for 5 of the hikers. Where are the other 4? Because 9 of them tried to go on the hike. So, they were finally found on 4th of May, so nearly a month after the original hike took place. The other 5 bodies were found under 4 meters, 13 feet, of snow in a ravine 75 meters further into the wood from the pine tree. 3 of the 4 were better dressed than others, and there were signs that some clothing were taken off those who had died first. Dubininya, I'm just gonna call her Dubi, was wearing Kriv's burnt, torn trousers, and her left foot and skin were wrapped in a torn jacket. Santos, initial thoughts of the corpses, where they were found, how they were found.
Right, so the most famous theory of the avalanche, some of it is a bit explained, so we can sort of see how they might get out in a rush. Maybe they're not wearing everything. They get to a safe place in the woods where the avalanche would not damage them too badly, at least, and they manage to get a fire going. So they leave those behind that don't have the clothing appropriate to do anything else other than stay there, and they end up dying. Now, problem is, the clothes that the final 4 were wearing were those of the ones that died first. They couldn't have been from those that tried to go to the camp, because obviously they were found in their clothes trying to go to the camp, right?
Yeah.
I find it hard to believe that, and again, in dire circumstances, I suppose human beings can do everything, but I find it hard to believe that they would get their clothes off. I don't know if that makes sense. That seems a bit too extreme to me. Like, how long were they dead for so that they would take their clothes off? Does that make any sense to you?
Yeah, no, yeah. As in, like, why would they do that?
Exactly. So they would have to have been dead for a while, I think, because that's not the first thing that comes to your mind, is it?
No.
So, oh, they're dead. Okay, well, time to go shopping, I guess. But it is quite weird, and it gets weirder, because there was an investigation after, right? And first, the medical investigation of the 5 bodies, as you said, concluded that they had died of hypothermia. Only one of the hikers having a small crack in his skull that wasn't really fatal. The other 3, however, were found to have major fatal injuries, such as skull damage and chest fractures. What's more interesting is that they didn't have any external wounds to suggest a high level of pressure. So you'd expect that if they were found under so much snow, that the pressure from the snow could have cracked their ribs, could crack their chest, and cracked their skulls, right? There was no evidence of external wounds to suggest that. But there's more, because one of the hikers was missing her tongue, her eyes, part of her lips, and even fragments of her skull. All injuries that were judged to have been caused after their death. which at the time led directly to a tribe of indigenous people, as they were suspected of attacking and murdering the hikers, but they were found innocent in the end with no connection to this. So there were no indications of other people nearby. The tent, like you said, was ripped from within. The victims had died 6 to 8 hours after the last meal. Some levels of radiation was found on the victims' clothing, and the official sort of conclusion to the investigation showed absolutely no information about the condition of the skier's internal organs. Which, if you're doing an investigation for disappearance of 9 people in the mountains, and one of the hikers appears to have no eyes, no tongue, and parts of her just being missing, you are going to investigate their organs, right? You're gonna look at what's going on inside. But there was no mention to it whatsoever. So the investigation ends, and in 2018, some journalists exhumed the bodies, and get this, the DNA analysis apparently was different from their living relatives. So the DNA in the bodies that they exhume are different from the members of their family that are living. Not only that, apparently one of the hikers' names was not even on the list of the cemetery. So officially he was never buried there. So then, in 2019, the Russian authorities reopened the case, but never seemed to give it the possibility of it being a crime. So they always attributed this event to 3 main theories, which is that of an avalanche, a slab avalanche, and a hurricane. Akash, why don't you explain us what the other theories are?
There's a reason why. Let's explain the avalanche theory first, because that is the state's and the investigators' official conclusion to this case. Andrei Kuryakov, deputy head of the Urals Federal District Directorate of the Prosecutor's General's Office, which is a fancy way of saying he's pretty high on the police force, he announced that the avalanche was the official cause of death for the Dyatlov group in 1959. Later, independent computer simulation and analysis by Swiss researchers also suggest avalanche as the cause. So, from this perspective, the snow slab, according to the researchers, would probably have made loud cracks and rumbles as it fell across the tent, making an avalanche seem imminent. Kuryakov noted that although the skiers made an error in the placement of their tent, everything they did subsequently was textbook. They conducted an emergency evacuation, which explains why the tent was cut open from the inside. They conducted an emergency evacuation to ground that would be safe from an avalanche and took shelter in the woods. They started a fire, they dug a snow cave, and then they all died to subsequent hypothermia. And for 5 of the hikers, they died to subsequent, I don't want to say fall damage, that's such a video game term, but they died to falling and also just the natural forces of the avalanche. So that is the official conclusion, the state conclusion. However, there are several contradictory evidences to the avalanche theory. So, the location of the incident did not have any obvious signs of an avalanche having taken place. An avalanche would have left certain patterns and debris distributed over a wide area. The bodies found within a month of the event, so the ones that were found next to the pine tree and in between the pine tree and the campsite, those bodies were covered with a very shallow layer of snow, and had there been an avalanche of sufficient strength to sweep away the second party, these bodies would have been swept away as well. This would have caused more serious and different injuries in the process, and would have damaged the tree line of the forest, which remained unscathed. We also have to remember that the second group of people, so the 5 that were found in the ravine, they, correct me if I'm wrong, Santos, but they did not have much external damage. Most of their damage was internalized, except for one of the hikers who was missing their tongue and their eyeballs, which is very specific. An avalanche can't do that. An avalanche doesn't gouge out your eyeballs. It buries you and crushes you.
Exactly, yeah.
It doesn't, things. The avalanche theory, while it's the most accepted one and it's the most straightforward one, it still leaves a lot of questions unanswered. Over 100 expeditions to the region have been held since the incident. None of them have ever reported conditions that might create an avalanche. And even if it did, a study of the area using up-to-date terrain-related physics revealed that the only time this could happen would be in April and May when snowfalls of winter were melting. During February, when the incident occurred, there was no such conditions.
Now we do have to say though that during that expedition the weather was really bad. Like reportedly was really bad. So that doesn't mean that the avalanche theory is not possible. It's just that it's still quite unlikely.
What other evidence there is that Dyatlov was an experienced skier, and the much older Zolotaryov was studying for his master's certificate in ski instruction and mountain hiking, and neither of these two men would have been likely to camp anywhere near the path of a potential avalanche. And on top of that, footprint patterns leading away from the tent were inconsistent with someone, let alone a group of 9 people, running in panic from either a real or imagined danger. All the footprints leading away from the tent and towards the woods were consistent with individuals who were walking at a normal pace. So, you can see why there are still some conspiracy theories floating around and why the Dyatlov Pass incident hasn't been put to rest, because there's so many questions that remained unanswered with the official investigation. And while a repeated investigation by the Russian Federation sort of backed up this theory by stating that there were high wind speeds, there was a snowstorm with temperatures reaching minus 40 degrees, it still doesn't really explain the other details. Now, there were other theories that were based around sort of natural causes, like natural forces, like the weather. There's something called katabatic wind. Katabatic winds are somewhat rare events and can be extremely violent. They were implicated in a 1978 case at Anaris Mountains in Sweden, where 8 hikers were killed and 1 was severely injured. And the topography of these locations were noted to be very similar to the ones of the Dyatlov expedition. However, while it has some ground, stuff like katabatic wind would not be possible. It would have blown the tent away as well if it was strong enough to force the hikers to deem the tent dangerous to reside in. Another one is infrasound. This was proposed by Donnie Eicher's 2013 book, Dead Mountain. Essentially, Eicher's theory is the infrasound generated by the wind as it passed over the top of the Holat Chachil Mountains was responsible for causing physical discomfort and mental distress. Eicher claims that because of their panic, the hikers were driven to leave their tent by whatever means necessary and fled down the slope. So, another interesting theory that the wind and the topography of the mountains cause this sort of infrasonic waves that were picked up by human ears and made them physically uncomfortable, as well as like mentally distressed. But, obviously, still does not explain the finicky details. Now, one speculation, which a lot of people have tried to research, is military testing.
And that is my favorite, by the way.
Do you want to explain it then?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
So, the military testing theory comes essentially because a lot of people since then, so this was years after the incident, a lot of people came forward saying that they saw orange flashes in the air, right? And that's really weird to begin with. One of these groups was a group of hikers that was not nearby, but also near enough that they would see those flashes. Now, on a first look basis, this might not mean anything. This is just people coming years after the incident saying they saw something. This happens all the time, and you should take it seriously, but you should take it with a grain of salt as well. What is really interesting is that one of the officers that was on the case came forward and said that he was told by higher-ups to absolutely deny that specific claim. So whoever said anything that involved those orange flashes, you just had to deny them. Flat out. Right? No attention given it whatsoever. Akash, you and I, we cover politics on our news episodes very, very often. And we've talked about Russia very, very often. So here we're talking about Soviet Russia. This was the height of the Cold War. Is it really that far-fetched to think that they might have been doing like weapon experiments nearby? Especially because that would probably explain the radiation levels that were found on the last group of bodies. What do you think about this one?
It's very interesting because this is definitely something that most people can agree is plausible. It's not one of those theories where like there is absolutely no evidence to it whatsoever, because one of the specific weapons that were named in the conspiracy was parachute mines. So this theory alleges that hikers woke up by loud explosions, fled the tent in a shoeless panic, and found themselves unable to return for supply retrieval. After some members froze to death, attempting to endure the bombardment, others commandeered their clothing only to be fatally injured by subsequent parachute mine concussions. And the reason why parachute mines are mentioned is because there are records of parachute mines being tested by the Soviet military in the area around the time the hikers were there. So, the Soviet military themselves have records of them testing parachute mines, which, coincidentally detonate while still in the air rather than striking the Earth's surface, and produce signature injuries similar to those experienced by the hikers, heavy internal damage with relatively little external trauma. And when you put this together with witnesses coming forth saying that they saw glowing orange orbs floating or falling from the sky, it all kind of weirdly lines up.
It fits together, doesn't it?
Yeah. And it's like, couple this with the fact that the autopsy report just conveniently forgot to study the hikers' internal organs, as well as reports that higher-ups tried to dismiss or hide the case or get it resolved as quickly as possible, which some would say is just regular procedure in the Soviet Union. But when you put all these together, it starts to make sense. Now, the only thing is Doobie's injuries. Like we mentioned, she had missing eyes and a cutout tongue. While the military tests do not explain this, most theorists postulate that this was scavenging animals. Some speculate that the bodies were unnaturally manipulated on the basis of characteristic livor mortis markings discovered during the autopsy, as well as burns to the hair and skin. Photographs of the tent, which were kept in the private investigator archives, but then later donated to the Dyatlov Foundation. Photographs of the tent allegedly show that it was erected incorrectly, something that experienced hikers were unlikely to have done. And obviously, talking about the radioactiveness found on the hikers' clothes, similar theories allege the testing of radiological weapons and is based partly on the discovery of radioactivity on some of the clothing, as well as descriptions of the bodies by relatives during the funerals as having orange skin and gray hair. Now, the state kind of butts back at this by saying that radioactivity would have affected all the hikers, not just be found on some of the clothes if it was a radioactive weapon, and the skin and hair discoloration can be explained by the natural process of mummification after 3 months of exposure to cold and wind. It's the initial suppression of by Soviet authorities of files describing the group's disappearance is sometimes mentioned as evidence of a cover-up, but the concealment of information about domestic incidents was considered standard procedure in the USSR. Now, there's a few smaller theories here and there, stuff like paradoxical undressing, which is just the idea that the hypothermia-induced hikers underwent temperature confusion and undressed, and that's what killed them, and that's why most of them weren't wearing much clothes. That does not explain, however, why some of them were wearing more clothes. There were other theories, they were attacked and chased by animal wildlife. This was disregarded because there were no animal tracks. High winds blew one member away, and others attempted to rescue that person. a large experienced group would not behave like this, and the winds that were strong enough to blow away a whole person would also have blown away the tent. And the last theory, I have an add-on to the military test theory, but the last theory that was discarded was that there was an argument, possibly related to a romantic encounter. That was why some of them were only partially clothed, and this led to a violent dispute. However, this clashed with the fact that these guys were all friends. They were largely harmonious. Apparently, they were just all kind of platonic with each other. There were no drugs present, not even any alcohol. The only alcohol was a small flask of medicinal alcohol, and that was found fully intact at the scene. The team even had sworn off cigarettes. But the military test theory, a little add-on, some say that it could have been not Soviet weapons testing, as we have mentioned before, but maybe due to a photo flash bomb dropped by a US spy plane. And to back this up, a declassified US document confirms that in the first half of 1959, there was such a secret mission near Nizhnaya Saida, which is relatively close to where the hikers were hiking. According to the theory, the US plane would drop a photo flash bomb, which, due to the mountains, exploded closer to the ground than expected. The explosion could have frightened the hikers, they left the tent and froze to death, and some of the hikers sustained direct injuries from the photo flash bomb. So that concludes kind of all the explanations for the Dyatlov Pass incident. Santos, which one do you think holds the most ground? Which one do you gravitate towards the most, do you feel like?
Here's the thing. My very logical side wants to give the Avalanche Theory the go-ahead, just because it would make somewhat more sense. Somewhat. It wouldn't explain everything, but at the same time, it could have been. Now, my conspiracy theorist side really wants the military testing one to be true, just because it just makes it more interesting, really. What I will say, though, is that in true Russian fashion, once the investigation was over, a round of shots was done to celebrate the hikers' lives. So when the Russians are drinking shots of vodka, you know at least it's got a good ending.
And that concludes our discussion of the Dyatlov Pass incident. What theories do you gravitate towards the most? What pieces of evidence do you think support the theories the most? Or how do you think this all played out? Obviously, there's still a lot that needs to be answered, even though officially this case has wrapped up. But if you like the stuff we do, follow us on Instagram and Twitter to keep up to date. Go check out the website, mildly-interesting.co.uk. All the episodes are up there, as well as extra articles and, other tidbits. Follow us on Spotify and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Hit that bell so you get notifications of when we next post. We've had some truly banging episodes recently. I do suggest you go watch all the recent ones. But without further ado, I'm Akash Lush.
And that was Sent.
And this was Mildly Interesting Amateur Investigators.
Mildly interesting. No, seriously, just mildly interesting.